Chapter 2. Gülen and Mill on Freedom. Humanistic thinking places freedom of thought and expression of ideas as a central plank of its platform, both philosophically and socio-politically. Free press, free and peaceful public protest, freedom of religion, the right to assemble, and other such institutions in the West all stem from the ideal of freedom articulated in modern humanisms, whereas in other parts of the world, including in Muslim lands, these freedoms stemmed from other sources. Philosophically, the ideal of freedom extends back to the ancient world as philosophers challenged themselves and others with all manner of ideas and sat debating them in the marketplace with anyone who would listen. Some of the greatest ideas of classical learning come from these philosophers, who, even if they were put to death or exiled for their ideas eventually, allowed themselves to think and speak freely, refusing to shackle their minds and voices when the state commanded it. In the modern West, several philosophers and writers powerfully express this ideal of freedom. In my view, however, none expresses this ideal more exhaustively and more radically than 19th century British social and political theorist John Stuart Mill. In this chapter, I place Mill into a dialogue with Gülen around the ideal of freedom of thought. Mill and Gülen are vastly different from each other in significant and obvious ways. Despite their different contexts and worldviews, both men articulate specific visions of society that at least theoretically would be tolerant in matters of religious belief and practice, and would allow vigorous inquiry and debate on issues related to truth in most, perhaps all, domains. These similarities between their respective societies exist because of their common commitment to the ideal of freedom, especially in matters of thought and conscience. Mill is perhaps most famous for utilitarianism, his work of ethical philosophy, and I will refer to this work later in the chapter. First, however, I wish to focus on another of his important works, On Liberty, published in 1859. In this text, Mill sets his project as articulation of social or civil liberty, that is, the nature and limits of the power that can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. He explains that a recent previous generation in the West concerned itself with the tyranny of magistrates and therefore developed representative forms of government that threw off the despotic powers of divine right monarchs and the like. He and his generation are the beneficiaries of that struggle, and for the most part no longer struggle against that kind of tyranny. Rather, Mill asserts, the current generation, that is, his generation in 19th century Britain, must fight another kind of tyranny, the tyranny of the majority. Mill says, "Protection, therefore, against the tyranny of the magistrate is not enough. There needs protection also against the tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling, against the tendency of society to impose, by other means than civil penalties, its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them, to fetter the development, and if possible, prevent the formation, of any individuality not in harmony with its ways, and compel all characters to fashion themselves upon the model of its own. There is a limit to the legitimate interference of collective opinion with individual independence, and to find that limit and maintain it against encroachment is as indispensable to a good condition of human affairs as protection against political despotism." In other words, Mill detects a subtle tyranny that exists in society even when representative government is in place. This tyranny is a social or civil tyranny, a pressure that society exerts on its members to conform to normal beliefs and practices in all parts of life simply because those are the norm and are practiced by the majority of people in the society. Therefore, says the logic of the majority, everyone should toe the line or be forced to do so. Mill rejects this tyranny and sets about to determine the principle by which we can determine the legitimate interference of the state or social agents with an individual's freedom, since mostly these determinations are made based purely on personal preference or custom. He states his principle of civic freedom early in the essay, that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. Over himself, over his body and mind, the individual is sovereign. This is a radical principle of freedom, one that probably no contemporary society implements consistently. It makes direct and measurable harm to others nearly the only legitimate grounds on which the state or civil authorities can interfere with an individual's actions. This principle is probably far too liberal for Gülen. For example, Islam in general forbids the taking of one's own life. So Mill's principle of freedom limited only by harm to others, not to oneself, is insufficient. Gülen, following Islamic teaching, would probably say that people do not have the freedom to harm themselves in the form of taking their own life. Nevertheless, resonance does exist between Gülen and Mill on this idea of freedom, particularly in the domain of thought and discussion, to which Mill devotes an entire chapter in his essay. Mill unequivocally supports freedom of thought and discussion, even if the ideas expressed and discussed in society end up being false. He says an assertion made to the community for consideration exists either as true, false, or somewhere in between, a partial truth or partial falsehood. Regardless, society's best interests are served when they allow free expression and discussion of ideas. If the idea is true, people will gain a fresh appreciation for its truth by discussing it, revisiting the arguments for its truth, and defending it against its detractors. In this way, the true ideas remain alive and vibrant for people instead of becoming stale and dormant from simply being accepted as true for generations. If the idea is false, society again benefits from the public discussion. Evidence of its falsehood is reviewed or made clear to everyone involved, and as a result, people can now embrace the truth more fully than before because of their fresh conviction. Most likely, Mill says, the idea expressed will be a mixture of truth and falsehood. Truly, no one has the full truth about anything. Human minds cannot conceive truth in its entirety about anything, and certainly not about God or the infinite, because we do not know things in themselves, but only our positional perceptions of things. Moreover, finite minds cannot conceive infinity. Therefore, all ideas should be expressed freely in society, so that partial truths can be strengthened into fuller truths through the mechanism of civil engagement and debate. The social benefits of free thought and discussion are clear enough, but Mill goes deeper into the actual impact that free thought has on individuals who make up society. Societies, especially with regard to religion, most often ban free thought and discussion in an effort to stop heresy, but such bans do not impact the heretics as much as they do everyone else. Mill says, "The greatest harm done is to those who are not heretics, and whose whole mental development is cramped, and their reason cowed by the fear of heresy. Who can compute what the world loses in the multitude of promising intellects combined with timid characters, who dare not follow out any bold, vigorous, independent train of thought, lest it should land them in something which would admit of being considered irreligious or immoral?" Mill's point here is that overweening fears of heresy stamp out not only heretics, but also those who have bold, new ideas to share about anything, including received traditions, even those considered sacred. When the threat of punishment for heresy is so strong in a society, or when a society threatens civil penalties on those who express ideas other than those expressly allowed by the civic authorities, all of society suffers. Mental strength comes with practice and challenge. A society that clamps down on thought and discussion becomes weak and atrophied. Mill continues, "No one can be a great thinker who does not recognize that as a thinker, it is his first duty to follow his intellect to whatever conclusions it may lead. Truth gains more even by the errors of one who, with due study and preparation, thinks for himself, than by the true opinions of those who only hold them because they do not suffer themselves to think." Again, true ideas become stagnant and weak when not regularly challenged in debate and discussion. Those who espouse true ideas do not hold those truths honestly if they have not allowed themselves to think freely, which may mean questioning long-held truths. Mill claims, however, that the point is not merely to create individual thinkers. He says, "Not that it is solely or chiefly to form great thinkers, that freedom of thinking is required. On the contrary, it is as much and even more indispensable to enable average human beings to attain the mental stature which they are capable of. There have been, and may again be, great individual thinkers in the general atmosphere of mental slavery. But there never has been, nor ever will be, in that atmosphere an intellectually active people." Here, we see Mill articulating the ideal of freedom for the most humanistic of reasons in addition to the utilitarian. Implied in this passage is a conviction that human beings are beings who think, who search for truth about myriad things from the most mundane to the most sublime, who create knowledge, and that these activities are part of what it means to be human. Freedom of thought, expression, and inquiry is vital not only for geniuses, who would never be able to share their genius for the benefit of society without the freedom to work. Freedom is vital, perhaps even more so, for common people going about their lives, people of common intelligence, so that they can be intellectually active and engaged people. Of course, this provides a benefit to society and is, thus, a utilitarian or functional claim, but it is also a humanistic claim because of what it holds for common people. People in general must be free to think, inquire, and to express, because to do so is what it means to be human. And only when allowed to be fully human can we create a society geared for the human as both an end and a means. Here also, we can bring Gülen into the discussion, for he most often speaks of the ideal of freedom in both humanistic and utilitarian terms. Gülen often speaks in his work of freedom from tyranny. In many contexts, he is referring to the tyrannies various groups of Muslims have endured in recent years under powers of secularism and colonialism. In other contexts, however, he speaks in more universal terms about the freedom each individual has by virtue of being human. His views resonate with Mill's stated principle of liberty when he asserts that freedom allows people to do whatever they want, provided they do not harm others and that they remain wholly devoted to the truth. The last phrase, that they remain wholly devoted to the truth, might cause Mill some pause at first. But he might argue that even those lost in or committed to falsehoods are wholly devoted to truth. They are just wrong about the truth. To speak or act in a way not wholly devoted to truth could include, for Mill and Gülen both, things like slander, libel, or yelling fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. Gülen's championing of tolerance is inconceivable without a commitment to freedom of thought and discussion, mainly because tolerance is unnecessary if freedom of thought, discussion, personal choice, and so on is not allowed. Tolerance is a virtue precisely because people are free and will choose different beliefs, religions, and pursuits. Gülen makes this point many times, often in discussions of democracy alone, or democracy and Islam, between which he sees no incompatibility whatsoever. In a piece on forgiveness, Gülen links tolerance and democracy through the concept of freedom. Democracy is a system, he says, that gives everyone who is under its wing the opportunity to live and express their own feelings and thoughts. Tolerance comprises an important dimension of this. In fact, it can be said that democracy is out of the question in a place where tolerance does not exist. Such statements, however, do not carry the radical edge of Mill's claims about the necessity of freedom and the protection people need from social tyranny. Only when Gülen exposits his notions of the ideal human beings, or the inheritors of the earth, as he calls them in one work, do we see not only the deep commitment to freedom, but also the rationale for such a commitment, a truly humanistic rationale. In The Statue of Our Souls, he lays out a broad vision for a society and world led by individuals of spiritual, moral, and intellectual excellence. He calls these people inheritors of the earth, and goes into some depth in describing their characters and attributes. In his enumeration of their central traits, the fifth trait he identifies as being able to think freely and being respectful to freedom of thought. He continues, being free and enjoying freedom are a significant depth of human willpower and a mysterious door through which man may set forth into the secrets of the self. One unable to set forth into that depth and unable to pass through that door can hardly be called human. So, freedom of thought is central to being human, to humanity itself. Without freedom of thought, not only as a social or political principle, but also as an ability in oneself, one cannot really be called a human being. In other words, one does not reach human capacity without freedom of thought. Gülen elaborates. In circumstances in which restrictions have been imposed on reading, thinking, feeling, and living, it is impossible to retain one's human faculties, let alone achieve renewal and progress. In such a situation, it is quite difficult to maintain even the level of a plain and common man, let alone to raise great personalities who leap with the spirit of renewal and reform, and whose eyes are on infinity. In such conditions, there exist only weak characters who experience deviations in their personalities, and men of sluggish souls and paralyzed senses. Human development, and by extension social development and growth, all reform and progress, depend on freedom of thought and living. A society without such freedom does not nurture the people of spirit and vision that lead it forward into new dimensions. Even worse, perhaps, such a society does not nurture common people to attain their fullest human capacities. Here, Gülen's ideas resonate with Mill's as he champions freedom for its usefulness to society and for its humanistic value. Indeed, the former is rooted in the latter, that is, freedom is beneficial to society because of the work it does in creating and developing human beings as individuals. As we saw in the previous section, human beings are of the highest value. It follows, then, that developing human capacity, or human beingness, is of the highest value as well. Gülen laments the recent history of Turkey and other Islamic regions where the populations have undergone and sometimes continue to endure social structures in which freedom of thought and learning are forbidden either through outright censure or through dominant state-sponsored ideologies. Regarding the world of Islamic learning in particular, he speaks of a vibrant past of scholarship and learning that was open to different fields of knowledge and scientific inquiry. In such a civilization, determinations concerning the proper boundaries for freedom were grounded in the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad and other such Islamic sources, which themselves accord high value to human freedom. That spirit of scholarship, however, gave way to narrowness and rote memorization of approved works. At that point, all human potential began its slow decay, easy prey for opportunistic tyrants, ideologues, and colonialists. He longs for a renewal among Muslims so that Islamic civilization can again take a place at the helm of global leadership, as it did in past centuries when much of what was constituted civilization came from the Islamic world. In order for that to happen, he says, we have to be more free-thinking and free-willed. We need those vast hearts who can embrace impartial free-thinking, who are open to knowledge, sciences, and scientific research, and who can perceive the accord between the Quran and the Sunnatullah in the vast spectrum from the universe to life. Without renewing a capacity for freedom of thought, both individually and collectively, Islamic civilization, indeed all civilization, is lost. No possibility of authentic, robust humanity exists without freedom of thought. No possibility of greatness in civilization exists without authentic humanity. So Gülen and Mill resonate with each other in many respects on the vital role that freedom plays in society, both in terms of its own functioning and in terms of general humanistic commitment. A society that oppresses free thought is not a thriving, working society, nor is it a society that values the human, no matter how it may attempt to defend its oppression by appealing to human interest. Now, however, I wish to address freedom in both Mill and Gülen from a slightly different angle. This has to do with the quality of freedom that both allow for in their respective work. We will see that the quality of freedom each claims for human beings is of a type that only human beings possess, and that therefore confirms the special dignity that human beings have in the world, which is reflected in humanistic discourse. On the theme of freedom, Mill is most known for his essay, On Liberty, which is why I have focused on it in this chapter. His other major work is Utilitarianism, a work in ethical philosophy that rejects Kantian ethics and attempts to articulate an ethical philosophy rooted in happiness or pleasure. Utilitarianism as a philosophy predates Mill, of course, and goes by many names throughout history, including Epicureanism. The most common name for this during Mill's time was the greatest happiness principle. Mill defines utilitarianism in his book. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure, and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and all desirable things, which are as numerous in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. In utilitarianism, as in ancient Epicureanism, pleasure and pain become the touchstones for what is good, to be desired, and ultimately for right and wrong. Mill here defines utilitarianism in a way completely consistent with the ancient Greek philosophy. He goes on to explain that, just like the ancient followers of Epicurus, he and other utilitarian thinkers are accused by their detractors of harboring a philosophy worthy only of pigs, because it is no better or nobler pursuit than pleasure, and this seems mean and groveling as a doctrine worthy only of swine. Mill answers this charge in the same way the ancient Epicureans answered it, namely by saying that it is not utilitarians, but their critics who are setting a swinish level for human beings because they assume that human beings are capable only of swine-like pleasures. In other words, people reject Epicureanism, often called ethical hedonism, or the greatest happiness principle, because in their minds, words like pleasure and happiness conjure images of profligacy, sensuality, and debauchery. If this is what pleasure means, then of course people reject it as an ethical guidepost. Mill, however, as did the Epicureans, rejects this criticism primarily because he views human beings as beings of higher capacity than animals, and thus capable and more fit for higher pleasures. He explains, "The comparison of the Epicurean life to that of beasts is felt as degrading, precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conceptions of happiness. Human beings have faculties more elevated than the animal appetites, and when once made conscious of them, do not regard anything as happiness which does not include their gratification. There is no known Epicurean theory of life which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasures than to those of mere sensation." So here we see a strong distinction made between human and animal pleasures, and a statement of higher human faculties and capacities that inherently find pleasure in nobler things. Those nobler things fall in the realm of the mind, the emotions, and the conscience, rather than in the realm of the body or sensation. Mill is not denying humans the capacity for sensory or bodily pleasures, far from it. He is simply defending himself against the charge of expositing an ethos that places sensual pleasures as its cornerstone. Human beings, the only beings who have moral capacity and who develop moral philosophies, have higher capacities for pleasure than the animals, and thus the pleasures set at the cornerstone of such a philosophy will be of a nobler nature. Mill continues by saying that people who have ample experience in both higher and lower pleasures give a greater preference to the former type, and prefer a mode of existence that prioritizes higher pleasures. No person in their right mind, he claims, would trade places with an animal in exchange for the fullest measure of animal pleasures. The fullest animal pleasures, which are instinctual and bodily, do not compare to the higher human pleasures of the mind, the emotions, and the conscience, even if these higher pleasures are marked with some pain. Mill says, "A being of higher faculties requires more to make him happy, is capable probably of more acute suffering, and certainly accessible to it at more points than one of an inferior type. But in spite of these liabilities, he can never really wish to sink into what he feels to be a lower grade of existence." Beings of higher capacity ultimately are not made truly happy by inferior pleasures. The happiness that is proper to human beings is one achieved not mainly in the domains of sensuality or corporeality, but primarily in the intellectual, emotional, and ethico-spiritual domains. This truth, according to Mill, is not undermined by the observed fact that people will often choose inferior pleasures at the expense of the higher. He acknowledges that people often choose against their better good in the name of a temporary, lesser pleasure. For example, some choose overindulgence in food or drink at the expense of their health, which is the greater good and provides more enduring pleasure. Others will abandon higher pursuits for low-level selfishness and indolence. Mill explains this by reference to human character, saying that for whatever reasons, people at some point lose touch with their inherent capacity for higher pleasures. He explains, "Capacity for the nobler feelings is in most natures a very tender plant, easily killed, not only by hostile influences, but by mere want of sustenance. And in the majority of young persons, it speedily dies away if the occupations to which their position in life has devoted them, and the society into which it has thrown them, are not favorable to keeping that higher capacity in exercise. Men lose their high aspirations as they lose their intellectual tastes because they have not time or opportunity for indulging them, and they addict themselves to inferior pleasure, not because they deliberately prefer them, but because they are either the only ones to which they have access or the only ones which they are any longer capable of enjoying." Mill, the social theorist, emerges in this passage. He spent much of his life writing about social reform and engaging in political activism to bring about positive changes in education, civic institutions, women's rights, and penal policy, many of which would find full endorsement by Gülen today. Moreover, the vast educational, cultural, and social activities of the Gülen movement would receive Mill's full endorsement as well. Mill's activism in all these areas is driven by his belief, which Gülen shares, in the inherent dignity of human beings, manifested here in the capacity for higher pleasures in the intellectual, emotional, and ethical domains. He firmly believes that all components of society should reflect this fact and should be ordered in such a way as to preserve and cultivate the capacities of inherent dignity in all people from the very earliest ages. Not to attempt to order society so is to commit a grave human and social injustice, or, in Gülen's view perhaps, a sin. Mill, in these passages, is defining pleasure in a specific way so as to distinguish it from the alleged pleasure of unbridled freedom in the merely sensual, corporeal realms. While a social principle of freedom he elaborates in On Liberty certainly gives people the room to waste their lives addicted to inferior pleasures at the expense of their highest and deepest selves, neither the principle nor his utilitarianism argues that such freedom is the highest goal of human life. One can argue, in fact, that that is not freedom at all, but instead a specific form of slavery or addiction. Gülen can join the conversation here because throughout his work, he draws a distinction between the life lived in search of the good, true, beautiful, and noble, and the life wasted on the temporal, whimsical, and merely corporeal. We will discuss this distinction more in the next chapter. But for now, let us say that Gülen defines freedom in a way parallel to Mill with regard to human dignity and capacity. Gülen says, "Those who regard freedom as absolute liberty confuse human freedom with animal freedom. Animals have no moral questions asked of them, and so are free of moral constraints. Some people desire this kind of freedom, and if they can, use it to indulge the darkest desires of the flesh. Such freedom is worse than bestial. True freedom, however, the freedom of moral responsibility, shows that one is human, for it motivates and enlivens the conscience and removes impediments to the spirit. Both Mill and Gülen, then, theorize human freedom in a way that locates it within a larger philosophy of human flourishing. Neither of them views libertinism as the highest mark of freedom. On the contrary, both elaborate freedom as that which provides the ground for the fullest development and expression of the highest and best of human capacities, the fulfillment of which provides for people the most enduring pleasures. These pleasures are in the intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and ethical domains. As I stated earlier, Gülen and Mill come from very different social, political, and religious contexts. No doubt, were they able to converse with each other face to face, they would differ in some of their determinations of the boundaries of freedom and tolerance in society. Both of them, however, agree on a point that is, in my view, much more fundamental to human life and flourishing. That is, freedom of thought and expression contextualized within a larger commitment to the general ideal of freedom. While people should be mindful of the possible consequences of their speech, they must still be able to think freely and express those thoughts in the world without fear of punishment. In my opinion, no direct and measurable harm is done to anyone from the simple expression in speech or writing of ideas. On the contrary, great health and benefit come to individuals and society as a whole when society structures itself to allow free thought, inquiry, and expression. Through this freedom, human beings allow themselves the maximum room to develop their inherent capacities for conscience, imagination, emotion, spirituality, and intellect. Only when these are developed and given the room to develop by appropriate social and political structures do human beings thrive and reach the highest possible limits of their achievement. Mill and Gülen are committed equally to this ideal of freedom within their respective contexts, primarily because they are both humanists in the broadest sense of the term, and the ideal of freedom is central to humanistic thinking. Moreover, as champions of human freedom, both are also champions of human greatness, not merely as an abstract ideal, but as a necessary part of human collective life in the actual world. Gülen, like many others, has a clear vision of human greatness, of the traits that define great human beings, those who actualize in themselves the highest and best of human potential. It is to this vision of human greatness, the human ideal to be actualized in time and space, that we now turn.